The early morning hours of June 22, 1941, found Joseph Stalin asleep in his dacha outside Moscow, surrounded by the security apparatus that insulated the Soviet dictator from the outside world. The phone calls began arriving around 3:30 in the morning, but the guards hesitated to wake him. Stalin had given explicit orders not to be disturbed, and those who disobeyed the General Secretary's instructions rarely enjoyed favorable outcomes. The guards conferred nervously, aware that the calls were urgent, but equally aware that waking Stalin prematurely could be interpreted as a grave offense. The situation creating the urgent calls was unfolding along the entire length of the Soviet western border. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, across more than 1,000 miles of frontier, German artillery had opened fire at precisely 3:15 a.m. Moscow time. Luftwaffe bombers were striking Soviet airfields, catching hundreds of aircraft on the ground. Three massive army groups comprising over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, had begun crossing into Soviet territory. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, was underway. Yet Stalin slept, and would continue sleeping for several more hours while the initial reports accumulated on desks in Moscow and junior officers debated who would take responsibility for waking the leader who had convinced himself that this invasion would not happen. The delay was not merely a matter of sleep schedules or bureaucratic timidity. It represented the culmination of months of willful self-deception, intelligence failures, and the corrosive effects of a political system where telling the dictator unwelcome truths could prove fatal. The warnings had been arriving for months, indeed for over a year. Soviet intelligence networks in Europe, among the most extensive and capable in the world, had reported with increasing alarm about German military preparations along the Soviet border. Richard Sorge, the brilliant Soviet spy operating in Tokyo, had sent multiple urgent messages identifying the approximate date of the planned invasion. British intelligence had passed warnings through diplomatic channels. Even German deserters had crossed the lines to warn Soviet forces of the impending attack. The accumulation of intelligence had been remarkable in its consistency and accuracy. Throughout the spring of 1941, reports flooded into Moscow from multiple sources, each corroborating the others. The NKVD received information from agents in Berlin about troop movements eastward. Military intelligence documented the concentration of German divisions along the border. Aerial reconnaissance photographed the buildup of supplies, airfields, and ammunition dumps. Radio intercepts revealed the activation of German command structures oriented toward the east. Sorge's reports from Tokyo were particularly specific and alarming. He had penetrated the German embassy in Japan and had access to diplomatic communications that revealed Hitler's intentions. In May 1941, Sorge sent a message stating that the invasion would occur in mid-June. He provided details about the number of divisions, the intended axes of advance, and the operational objectives. His information was so precise that it should have been impossible to ignore. Yet Stalin had scrawled in the margins of intelligence reports that they were British provocations. He ordered the arrest of the intelligence officer who had compiled a particularly comprehensive assessment of German invasion preparations, accusing him of spreading panic and disinformation. When the head of military intelligence personally briefed Stalin on the German threat, the dictator cut him short and warned him against believing enemy propaganda. The British warnings were similarly dismissed. Churchill had authorized British intelligence to share information about German plans with Moscow, hoping to ensure the Soviet Union was prepared for the attack that British code-breaking had revealed. The warnings were conveyed through diplomatic channels with unusual specificity, but Stalin interpreted them as British attempts to provoke a German-Soviet war that would relieve pressure on Britain.
He believed Churchill was trying to manipulate him into actions that served British interests rather than Soviet security. Even more remarkably, German soldiers began deserting across the border in the days immediately before the invasion, specifically to warn Soviet forces that an attack was imminent. These deserters risked their lives to cross into Soviet territory and report that their units had been moved into assault positions, that ammunition had been distributed, that the attack would begin within hours or days. Soviet border guards dutifully reported these warnings up the chain of command. The reports reached Moscow. Stalin's response was to order that deserters be interrogated to determine whether they were part of a German disinformation campaign. The dismissal of these warnings reflected not just Stalin's personal judgment, but structural problems in the Soviet system. Intelligence analysts learned that reporting German attack preparations led to accusations of alarmism or worse. Some intelligence officers who had been too insistent about the German threat had been arrested and disappeared into the Gulag. The survivors learned to shade their reports, to include caveats, to avoid conclusions that might anger Stalin. The result was that even when intelligence reached the dictator, it had been filtered through layers of self-censorship designed to avoid provoking his displeasure. Stalin had dismissed every warning. He had called the intelligence reports provocations, attempts by Britain to drag the Soviet Union into war with Germany. He had ordered the arrest of intelligence officers who insisted too strongly on the accuracy of their sources. He had forbidden military preparations that might be interpreted as provocative by Berlin. When commanders requested permission to bring border forces to higher alert status, he denied the requests. When the concentration of German forces became so obvious that even casual observers could not miss it, Stalin convinced himself it was an elaborate bluff designed to extract concessions. This systematic denial was not simple foolishness, though it would be remembered as one of history's most catastrophic intelligence failures. Stalin's worldview had been shaped by decades of revolutionary conspiracy and political intrigue, where deception was constant and trust suicidal. He believed he understood Hitler's strategic position better than his own intelligence officers did. Germany was still fighting Britain, still had not achieved the strategic victory in the West that would free it to turn eastward. Attacking the Soviet Union before defeating Britain would mean fighting a two-front war, the very mistake that had doomed Germany in the First World War.
Moreover, Stalin believed he had bought time with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. The non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had shocked the world, aligning two ideological enemies in a cynical division of Eastern Europe. Stalin had calculated that the pact would keep Germany focused westward, while the Soviet Union built up its military strength. He had meticulously fulfilled Soviet obligations under the pact, shipping grain, oil, and raw materials to Germany, even as intelligence warned of German treachery. He believed that maintaining the economic relationship would give Hitler reasons to preserve the peace, or at least to negotiate before attacking. The dictator had also convinced himself that he would receive warning before any German attack, not the kind of intelligence warnings he had been receiving and ignoring, but clear diplomatic signals. He expected that Hitler would present demands, that there would be an ultimatum, that the Germans would seek concessions through negotiation before resorting to war. Stalin had prepared various territorial and economic offers he was willing to make to preserve peace. He assumed that when Germany was ready to move against the Soviet Union, there would be a clear political process that preceded military action. His assumption reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of Hitler's character and strategic thinking. The Nazi dictator had no intention of negotiating. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not a means to achieve limited political objectives, but an ideological crusade to destroy Bolshevism and secure Lebensraum for German expansion.
Hitler had deceived Stalin not through elaborate diplomatic maneuvering, but through the Soviet leader's own unwillingness to believe that the attack would come without warning. The result was that when the invasion began, Soviet forces along the border were in perhaps the worst possible posture. They were not at peacetime readiness, which would have at least maintained unit cohesion and clear command structures, nor were they at wartime alert, which would have positioned them to resist the initial German onslaught. Instead, they were in a confused intermediate state, partially mobilized but forbidden to take defensive measures that might provoke Germany. Units were out of their barracks, but not in defensive positions. Aircraft were concentrated on forward airfields for efficiency, but not dispersed for protection. Ammunition was moved closer to the border, but not distributed to combat units. The German attack achieved surprise that was nearly total. In the first hours, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most caught on the ground. German armored spearheads penetrated deep into Soviet territory, bypassing resistance and racing toward operational objectives. Communication systems broke down as German strikes hit command posts and signal centers. Soviet commanders found themselves unable to contact higher headquarters, uncertain about the scope of the attack, and without clear orders about how to respond. The Luftwaffe strikes on Soviet airfields were devastating in their precision and effectiveness. German intelligence had mapped every Soviet airfield within range, identifying where aircraft were parked, where fuel was stored, where ammunition was kept. The first wave of attacks came at dawn, catching Soviet air units completely unprepared. Aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip for ease of maintenance and fueling, presenting perfect targets for German bombers and strafing fighters. Soviet pilots who survived the initial attacks found their aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Those who managed to get airborne discovered that their planes were outmatched by German fighters and that coordinated air defense was impossible with command and control systems in chaos. By the end of the first day, the Soviet Air Force in the border military districts had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. The ground assault was equally devastating. German artillery preparation had been brief but intense, targeting Soviet command posts, communication centers, and known defensive positions. Then the armor and motorized infantry began moving, not attacking the Soviet defensive lines head-on, but flowing around them, seeking gaps, exploiting weak points, racing deep into Soviet rear areas to sever communication and supply lines. Soviet defensive positions that had been prepared to resist attacks found themselves bypassed and irrelevant. German commanders followed the doctrine of advancing until they met serious resistance, then bypassing that resistance to continue the advance. Strong points were masked and left for following infantry divisions to reduce. The armored spearheads kept moving, creating penetrations dozens of kilometers deep within the first day. The speed of the German advance created chaos in Soviet rear areas. Supply dumps found themselves in the front lines. Headquarters units discovered German tanks approaching positions they had thought were hundreds of kilometers from the fighting. Communications broke down as telephone lines were cut and radio stations were overrun. The careful plans for coordinated defense that Soviet staff officers had prepared became meaningless as the situation changed faster than information could be transmitted. Soviet counterattacks, when they were attempted, were poorly coordinated and executed piecemeal. Individual divisions or brigades would attack without air support, without adequate artillery preparation, without knowledge of what friendly units on their flanks were doing. German forces, operating with superior coordination and communication, defeated these attacks in detail. Soviet tank units, often equipped with vehicles superior to the German panzers in armor and armament, were squandered in hasty, uncoordinated attacks that accomplished nothing except to add to the casualty lists. By the end of the first day, German forces had advanced up to 80 kilometers in some sectors. Entire Soviet armies had lost communication with their headquarters. The commanders of Soviet military districts were trying to piece together what was happening from fragmentary reports that contradicted each other. The scale of the disaster was becoming apparent, but the mechanisms for responding to it had been shattered in the initial assault. Stalin's guards finally woke him around 7 in the morning, nearly 4 hours after the invasion began. The General Secretary's initial reaction was disbelief mixed with fury. He refused to accept that a full-scale invasion was underway, insisting that it must be a provocation by German generals acting without Hitler's authorization. He called it a frontier incident that had been blown out of proportion. He demanded to know why he was being bothered with reports of border skirmishes when he had ordered not to be disturbed. The Commissar of Defense, Semyon Timoshenko, and the Chief of the General Staff, Georgy Zhukov, arrived at the Kremlin to brief Stalin on the situation. The reports they brought left no room for the interpretation Stalin wanted to maintain. German forces had crossed the border along its entire length. Major cities were under air attack. Communications with forward units were being lost. The invasion was not a provocation or a bluff, but a full-scale assault by the entire German military machine.
Even confronted with these facts, Stalin's reaction was not to immediately mobilize Soviet defenses, but to seek some diplomatic escape. He ordered that German border violations should be protested through official channels. He insisted that there must be some misunderstanding, that perhaps local German commanders had exceeded their authority. He could not or would not accept that Hitler had decided to tear up their non-aggression pact and launch the war that Stalin had convinced himself would not happen. The hours that followed Stalin's awakening were characterized by confusion, denial, and paralysis at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. While German forces drove deeper into Soviet territory, while entire Soviet armies were being encircled, while the Red Air Force was being destroyed on the ground, the Soviet command structure struggled to formulate a coherent response. Stalin's initial orders reflected his continuing hope that this was somehow not a real war, that it could be managed through diplomatic channels, that it would prove to be something less than the catastrophe that was unfolding. The Soviet leader's first directive to the military was bizarrely cautious given the circumstances. He ordered Soviet forces to engage the Germans, but not to cross the border into German territory. He wanted to avoid any action that might be characterized as Soviet aggression. He still seemed to believe that if Soviet forces behaved with restraint, the conflict might be contained or reversed through diplomacy. The order demonstrated a complete failure to grasp the reality that Germany had committed its full military power to the destruction of the Soviet state, and that diplomatic considerations were now utterly irrelevant. As the day progressed and more reports arrived, each one worse than the last, the magnitude of the disaster slowly penetrated Stalin's denial. Entire Soviet air fleets had been wiped out. German armored columns had advanced dozens of kilometers. Cities in Belarus and Ukraine were under attack. The border fortifications that were supposed to delay any German attack had been bypassed or overwhelmed in hours. The military situation was not just serious, but catastrophic and deteriorating with every passing hour. The psychological impact on Stalin of realizing that his judgment had been so catastrophically wrong was profound. The dictator who had dominated the Soviet Union for over a decade, who had purged anyone who questioned his wisdom, who had built a cult of personality around his supposed genius, now faced the irrefutable evidence that he had led his country into disaster. He had ignored warnings, dismissed intelligence, forbidden preparations, and convinced himself that his understanding of geopolitics was superior to that of his intelligence officers and military commanders. He had been wrong about everything. The collapse of Stalin's confidence manifested in ways that shocked those who knew him. The dictator who had always projected absolute certainty now appeared uncertain, indecisive, almost paralyzed.
He questioned whether he should remain in Moscow or flee to the interior. He wondered aloud whether the Soviet people would continue to follow his leadership after such a catastrophic failure. For the first time in years, those around him saw vulnerability rather than the implacable will that had characterized his rule. The impact extended beyond Stalin personally to the broader Soviet leadership. The Politburo members who had always deferred to Stalin's judgment now faced a crisis where they were expected to make decisions while their leader was effectively incapacitated. But the system Stalin had created offered no mechanisms for leadership succession or collective decision-making. Everyone had been trained to wait for Stalin's direction. When that direction was not forthcoming, the entire apparatus of government and military command struggled to function. Some members of the Soviet leadership briefly considered whether Stalin should be replaced. Whispered conversations occurred about whether someone else should take charge of the war effort, whether the catastrophe created an opportunity to remove a leader whose judgment had proven so flawed. But these conversations went nowhere. The terror of the purges was too recent, the consequences of challenging Stalin too dire. Even in crisis, even with Stalin effectively absent, no one dared move against him. Stalin's response to this realization was a form of psychological collapse. He retreated to his dacha and for several days essentially withdrew from active leadership. He did not give orders, did not make decisions, did not provide the direction that the Soviet war effort desperately needed. Whether this was depression, shock, fear of being blamed, or complete mental breakdown, the effect was the same. The Soviet Union faced the greatest crisis in its history without effective leadership at the crucial moment. The absence of Stalin's direction created a vacuum at the top of the Soviet system. The military commanders and party officials who might have taken charge in his absence were paralyzed by the same fear that had prevented earlier action. No one wanted to be seen as usurping Stalin's authority or making decisions that he might later repudiate. The cult of personality and the terror of the purges had created a system where everyone looked to Stalin for direction, and when that direction was not forthcoming, the system froze. Meanwhile, the military situation deteriorated with horrifying speed. The German army groups were executing a strategy of deep penetration and encirclement, using their armored and motorized forces to bypass Soviet strongpoints and cut off entire armies from retreat. The strategy was working brilliantly. Soviet forces, already confused by the surprise attack and the absence of clear orders, found themselves surrounded in vast pockets. Entire army groups, hundreds of thousands of men, were being cut off and methodically destroyed. The initial German successes exceeded even the optimistic projections of German planners. The Red Army, despite its numerical superiority and despite the warnings that should have allowed preparation, was being shredded. The purges of the late 1930s had decimated the Soviet officer corps, removing experienced commanders and replacing them with politically reliable but often militarily incompetent officers. The survivors had learned that initiative was dangerous and questioning orders could be fatal. The result was an army that at the crucial moment lacked the flexibility and leadership necessary to respond effectively to the German onslaught. The Soviet soldiers themselves fought with courage that surprised the Germans. Individual units cut off and surrounded continued to resist long after their positions became hopeless. Red Army soldiers endured casualties that would have broken other armies and continued fighting. But courage without effective leadership, without clear strategy, without the supplies and support necessary for sustained combat, was not enough to stop the German advance. By late June, less than a week into the invasion, the scale of the disaster was undeniable even to Stalin. Minsk had fallen. The Germans had advanced over 300 kilometers into Soviet territory. Entire armies had ceased to exist as organized formations. The Soviet Union had lost thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The speed and completeness of the German victory was shocking even to those who had anticipated that the initial phase would favor Germany. The fall of Minsk was particularly devastating, both militarily and symbolically. The Belarusian capital was a major city and transport hub, and its loss opened the direct route to Moscow. More significantly, its capture came as part of a massive encirclement operation that trapped several Soviet armies. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply and reinforcement, facing annihilation or surrender. The Minsk pocket would eventually yield over 300,000 prisoners, a staggering loss that gutted the Soviet defensive capabilities in the central sector. The pattern repeated across the front. In the north, German forces advanced towards Leningrad with alarming speed. In the south, they drove into Ukraine, threatening Kyiv and the industrial heartland. Everywhere, the story was the same. Rapid German advances, Soviet forces overwhelmed or bypassed, massive encirclements that destroyed entire armies. The Red Army was not simply losing battles, it was systematically being destroyed as an organized fighting force. The reports reaching Moscow grew progressively more catastrophic. Each day brought news of another city fallen, another army encircled, another defensive line broken. The maps in the Kremlin war room had to be updated constantly as German penetrations deepened. Staff officers struggled to keep track of which Soviet units still existed and which had been destroyed. The military leadership faced the nightmare scenario of conducting operations when they no longer had clear knowledge of their own force dispositions. Stalin finally emerged from his retreat and began to reassert control. His first actions demonstrated that he had learned nothing from the disaster his misjudgments had created. Rather than acknowledging his errors, he looked for scapegoats. General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Front that had borne the brunt of the German assault, was recalled to Moscow, arrested, and executed along with his senior staff officers. They were charged with treason and incompetence, blamed for a disaster that resulted directly from Stalin's own decisions to ignore.
This narrative served important purposes beyond protecting Stalin's reputation. It provided a framework for understanding the catastrophe that allowed the Soviet people to maintain morale despite the terrible defeats. It transformed the war from a consequence of Stalin's errors into an epic struggle of the Soviet people against fascist aggression. It created a mythology of resistance that would sustain Soviet fighting spirit through years of brutal combat. But the narrative also prevented learning from the disaster. The actual lessons, that intelligence must be believed even when inconvenient, that preparation is essential, that wishful thinking is not strategy, that a climate of fear prevents effective decision-making, were not absorbed. Stalin's hold on power was not weakened by his catastrophic misjudgment. If anything, the war emergency strengthened his position by making criticism even more dangerous than it had been before. The question of how Stalin could have so completely misread the situation has occupied historians ever since. Part of the answer lies in his peculiar combination of paranoia and arrogance. He trusted no one, but was supremely confident in his own judgment. He saw plots everywhere, but could not imagine that Hitler might simply decide to attack without the elaborate diplomatic maneuvering Stalin expected. He had convinced himself that he understood the strategic situation better than his intelligence services, better than his military commanders, better than the foreign leaders who warned him. The political system Stalin had created contributed to the disaster. The purges had eliminated anyone who might have challenged his judgment with sufficient force to change his mind. The climate of fear meant that even when intelligence officers and military commanders knew Stalin was wrong, they lacked the courage or the means to insist on the truth. The cult of personality meant that Stalin's judgments were treated as infallible, making it psychologically difficult even for Stalin himself to admit error. There was also an element of genuine strategic miscalculation independent of Stalin's personality flaws.
The logic that attacking the Soviet Union while still at war with Britain would be strategic folly was not absurd. It was, in fact, the conventional wisdom among military analysts, and not just in the Soviet Union. Many Western observers also expected that Germany would not open a second front until Britain was defeated or neutralized. The mistake was not in the strategic analysis, but in assuming that Hitler would be constrained by conventional strategic logic. The consequences of Stalin's failure to prepare for the invasion were measured in millions of lives. The initial phase of Operation Barbarossa was devastating beyond anything in military history. By December 1941, the Germans had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow, had besieged Leningrad, and had occupied vast territories, including Ukraine's industrial heartland. Soviet casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, exceeded 3 million in the first 6 months. The material losses in tanks, aircraft, and equipment were similarly staggering. These losses were not inevitable. Had Soviet forces been properly prepared, had they been deployed in defensive positions, had commanders been authorized to respond to German concentrations with preemptive measures, the initial German successes would have been far less dramatic. The Soviet Union would still have faced a formidable invasion, would still have endured a brutal war, but the catastrophic nature of the initial defeats resulted directly from the unpreparedness that Stalin had enforced. Yet the Soviet Union survived. Despite the terrible defeats of 1941, despite losing millions of soldiers and vast territories, despite German forces reaching the gates of Moscow and Leningrad, the Soviet state did not collapse. The reasons for Soviet survival were complex: the vast spaces of Russia that absorbed German advances, the brutal winter that arrived just as German logistics reached breaking point, the mobilization of Soviet industry east of the Urals, the fighting spirit of Soviet soldiers and civilians, and eventually the material support provided by Allied Lend-Lease. Stalin's role in Soviet survival was contradictory. His pre-war leadership had contributed to the disaster through the purges that weakened the military and the refusal to prepare that enabled German surprise. But his wartime leadership, after the initial shock wore off, proved effective in certain crucial ways. He learned to delegate operational decisions to competent commanders like Zhukov. He ruthlessly prioritized military production over civilian needs. He appealed to Russian nationalism alongside communist ideology to motivate resistance. He managed the alliance with Britain and the United States with considerable skill. The historical verdict on Stalin's failure to prepare for the invasion is harsh but merited. The warnings were clear, numerous, and accurate. The evidence of German intentions was overwhelming. The cost of preparation would have been modest compared to the catastrophic cost of surprise. Stalin's refusal to act on the intelligence he received represented a failure of leadership that ranks among the worst in modern history. Yet Stalin never acknowledged his error. The official Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War emphasized the heroic resistance and ultimate victory, while obscuring the disasters of the initial period and their causes. Stalin's reputation in the Soviet Union emerged from the war enhanced rather than damaged, credited with leading the nation to victory without accounting for his role in making that victory far more costly than necessary. The story of how Stalin learned that Hitler was invading the Soviet Union is ultimately a story about the dangers of authoritarian systems, the costs of eliminating dissenting voices, and the catastrophic consequences when leaders believe their own propaganda. It is a reminder that intelligence is worthless if leaders refuse to accept information that contradicts their preconceptions. It demonstrates that even powerful states with capable intelligence services can suffer devastating surprise attacks when political considerations override security imperatives. The early morning of June 22, 1941, stands as one of history's great inflection points. The invasion that began that day would become the largest and bloodiest theater of the Second World War, ultimately costing over 25 million Soviet lives. The outcome would determine the fate of Europe for the next half-century, and it all began with a dictator who slept while the bombs fell, who refused to believe the invasion was happening, even as German tanks crossed his borders, who had convinced himself that his understanding of geopolitics was superior to the accumulated evidence that proved him catastrophically wrong. Stalin learned that Hitler was invading the Soviet Union several hours after the invasion began, not because the information was unavailable, but because he had created a system where no one dared wake him with news he did not want to hear. The delay was symbolic of the larger failure: intelligence ignored, preparations forbidden, warnings dismissed, all because one man's judgment was treated as infallible and no institutional mechanisms existed to correct his errors. The Soviet Union would eventually win the war, but the cost of that victory was measured partly in the hours that Stalin slept while his country burned, and the months of willful blindness that preceded them.